So we're going to get going just out of respect for everyone's time. I think Carrie said we're ready. So I'm going to call this meeting of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. This is a working session. For the record, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 City Councilor and also the chair of the Council's Ways and Means Committee. I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Councilor Ed Flynn, District 2, Councilor Liz Braden, District 9, Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, District 5, Councilor Julia Mejia at large, and then my co-sponsor on this matter, Councilor Andrea Campbell, who's also the chair of the Council's Public Safety and Criminal Justice Committee. This working session is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will be rebroadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. Today's working session is on Docket 0840, Order for a hearing regarding police contracts as policy documents. A hearing was held on this docket on September 8th, where the committee heard from Darlene Lombos, Greater Boston Labor Council, DeRay McKesson, and Samuel Sinyangwe, Campaign Zero, Dennis Galvin from the Mass Association for Professional Law Enforcement, Pam Coker from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, Mallory Honora, and others from Families for Justice's Healing. And we also took public testimony. The purpose of today's hearing, I want to speak just a little bit about sort of where we've come and where we're going. So as folks remember, we had a lot of conversation back in June around the budget, about the police department budget, about its appropriate size, about the overtime budget, which has routinely run over and also grown quite a lot in recent years, and thinking about, how our budgets and public safety could be better aligned in the city. And obviously the council and the mayor ultimately did reallocate $10 million from the police budget to other budgets in departments around the city. But one of the conversation points at that point was that a huge amount of how policing and public safety work is structured in the city is tied up in the city's police contracts, which are up for renegotiation this year. And the council has a very particular role vis-a-vis those contracts. We don't sit at the bargaining table. That's the job of the mayor's Office of Labor Relations. And I have a letter from them that I'll read in a moment. And we're not in the room in the back and forth of the bargaining table, but all such contracts that come to before the city, once they're agreed, come to the city council's Ways and Means Committee. It's meeting here today, and then ultimately for a full council vote for ratification. And this council actually, at the last round of public safety contracts, published a unanimous letter, which a number of councilors, including my co-sponsor, Councilor Campbell, were signatories to, just saying that we really need to think about how to do these differently. And we need to think about that because of the broad public policy implications, both because of the proportion of the city's budget that is made up of the police department budget, and because of the very unique role that police have in our society as frontline city workers who are entrusted with the use of force, right? Which I think every police officer would acknowledge is a sacred duty, and also puts a particular kind of emphasis of need for public scrutiny and a public policy interest in the work and how it's governed. So the thing that I said in July when this hearing order was originally filed by myself, Councilor Campbell, and Councilor Edwards, who'll be joining us in a bit, is that I think that what makes sense in this moment is for the council to establish clear public policy expectations that the parties in these negotiations can be negotiating aware of, because ultimately this council has the ability to vote down collective bargaining agreements. But I think that it's much more fruitful rather than a multi-year negotiation resulting in a contract that the council thinks doesn't meet its public policy expectations, but it's never articulated those, to actually sort of articulate them and have the public conversation. And also not just have the public conversation for the sake of this body and come into some agreement amongst us about what we expect, but because these police contracts have a real bearing on the lives of our citizens in the city of Boston, our residents, and they're kind of opaque and a little bit hard for folks to know the ways in which how we do policing is tied up in them. And so this has also been a process of having the public's voice in the room, and there's a lot of community advocates who have been reading through the police contracts and kind of coming to grips with them. And we had at the last hearing, folks come in to sort of offer us perspective on how this is done in other parts of the country. And so the point is to say that although there's a negotiation that happens at the bargaining table that isn't happening in public, that doesn't mean we can't have this public policy conversation about the expectations and the way it affects life in our city together. So that's sort of the framing, and the way that I'm thinking about this working session. I sent a document, which I apologize for the late arrival of, that I mostly was going to use as a guide to talk through some things today, because I kind of want to get a sense of the room. And what I mean by that is I don't think we have to hash everything out as a council about this issue today. And I know that people are in different places. But I do think that it's important for a majority of the council to be able to come to some kind of clear articulation of public policy expectations vis-a-vis these contracts. And I think we should do that sooner rather than later. And so I think, as you all know, that, you know, we can only really have these conversations together in public, and that's what we're doing in this working session. So that's sort of the spirit in which I want to guide this today, which is to basically say, here are the things that I've been hearing in my capacity as chair from the hearings we've had, not just the one on this docket, but the ones on overtime. And here are some of the types of expectations I think that might lead to us needing to set. And what do other people think? Does this reflect what counselors are hearing, what counselors feel about this matter? So that's kind of the goal of today's working session. Before I read the letter from the administration, I want to let my colleague, Councillor Campbell, say a few words about the hearing. And then if any other counselors want to just make opening remarks, I'll entertain those as well. But first off, Councillor Campbell.
I'll be brief. Thank you, Councillor Box. I think you summed it up well, and, you know, appreciate the partnership here. This is new as we think about, I think, really creatively how we can create a space within the collective bargaining process for counselors to participate, to bring what they're hearing from their constituents into the fold, even though legally, of course, we cannot be at the bargaining table. We heard obviously from community folks, residents, advocates. We continue to hear from folks about things they would like to see changed within our policing system, so that it's more transparent and accountable. And we know that some of those changes can only be made if the collective bargaining agreement is changed. And so in order for that to happen, we of course want to know what the administration is advocating for, what they are pushing, what they are advocating be changed. And I think there's a way to do that while still, of course, honoring the process of negotiation. And so I really, you know, was hoping to hear from the administration sort of a follow-up on the conversation in September on what the advocates and other residents were pushing for, what their stances have been since on things related to discipline, overtime, of course, in other things related to training as well. And so have questions or had a long list of various things, but we will see where that goes. But again, appreciate the partnership and continuing the conversation. And of course, thank you to my council colleagues who are on here. And it's great to see Julia, who I know just had a loss in her family. So I didn't expect to see you on here. So sending you love through this Zoom platform as well. Okay, thank you, Councillor Bach.
Thank you so much, Councillor Campbell. And definitely share in those wishes. Next up, I'll go to Councillor Flynn. Any opening remarks?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Bach. I want to say thank you to you, Councillor Bach, and to the sponsors for forwarding this important discussion. I would also like to highlight a couple issues that I would like to see as part of policy, but let me just say briefly, over the last year, it's been a very difficult time for everyone in our city, including the police. But you know, I'm also concerned about the number of police we have in the department. I think it needs to significantly be increased. You know, 300, 400 more officers. We're looking at retirement soon, but I think that will help the situation as it relates to overtime. But we need to hire more officers. But just back on my original point of the difficult year, I had the opportunity when I was younger to be on 2 deployments. And after a deployment from the military, it takes you a long time and your family a long time to readjust, to get back into society, into civilian society. But what these police officers, public safety officials, EMS, what they've done over the last year during this pandemic has been very challenging. They've done an exceptional job. But I also think we have to be upfront and say we need to work on mental health related issues. As Councilor Campbell mentioned, training issues, but certainly mental health, counseling, medical, making sure our police officers and their families also get the medical care that they might need. I think that's an important part of our conversation. I'm looking forward to talking about that, but I think it's critical that we acknowledge after a very difficult year that a lot of our city employees are going to need time off, but they're also going to need medical care, and how we implement that will be an important part of the conversation. I didn't mean to talk too long, but I want to say thank you to Councilor Bach and my colleagues as well.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Flynn. And I'm going to go slightly out of order and just allow Councillor Mejia to say a few words because I think she's got to step away for a second in a minute. So Councillor Mejia.
Yes, thank you. So I don't have an elaborate speech other than, working on this job the last 8 or 10 months, I've learned a lot about how things work and how things don't work and why there's so many people who look to us to change things that we have very little control over. And I think that this is one of those conversations that was a really wake-up call for me. These are tax dollars. In many ways, we are paying salaries, and I feel like we need to have a voice in what this looks like. And so looking forward to figuring out how we can balance this. We're here to do the people's work, and I think the people are looking to us to figure out how we can make the contracting process be more reflective of the community, and I'm here for it.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you also to your co-sponsors of this really important discussion. I won't take much time this afternoon. I just feel that we have an immense responsibility to ensure that the city's tax dollars are spent responsibly, and that we identify places where we can be more effective in utilizing those dollars. While also recognizing the incredible value of so much of the work of our police department. It's a complicated conversation that I look forward to taking part in, and it won't all be sorted out this afternoon, I'm sure. So I think this is a process, just step by step, figuring out what ways we can improve our management of the city's budget. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Braden. Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think there's a lot left to be said on this topic. What I will say is we have a current system that allows officers, and actually not so much the exception, but it becomes the rule, that we have officers making in the 6 figures. We have officers making more than the mayor, making more than the governor, making more than the presidents of the United States of America on any given year. That can't be normalized. And I think it has, to a large extent, been normalized in how we do our budgeting and how we do these things. And one of the things that I am sort of focused on and have been focused on in the other hearings that we've had about, kind of our overtime spending, and I know others on this council are as well, is the formulas that we use for staffing, the formulas and metrics that we use to determine whether or not something that we're expending resources and finances on, whether or not it's successful or not, the measurables, in other words, that we're using to determine whether or not crime is being lowered due to any of these metrics of spending that we're doing, or whether or not it's something else that we're funding. We don't have a lot of that data the way we should. And so, as we talk about these contracts, I think it's also important to talk about what we're using to measure this and how we're making data publicly available. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Councillor Arroyo. I think that is everybody. So I want to read the letter. As Councillor Campbell says, frustratingly, we are not joined by the administration today. I will read their letter, and then, but I do actually think there's a fair bit that we can talk about. So letter of today, November 30th, to Councillor Kenzie Bach, Chair Ways and Means Committee. Dear Chairwoman Bach, thank you for your invitation to participate in a working session on Docket 0840 regarding police contracts as policy documents. We must respectfully decline your invitation. As was previously communicated to the Council, collective bargaining strategies and/or objectives are confidential matters that are not appropriate to disclose at a public hearing. The standard for confidentiality in collective bargaining strategy is longstanding, and any change in the standard should be approached with caution and care, as exceptions made in one instance could well set a precedent for others. Please be assured that the Walsh administration is moving forward aggressively to undertake meaningful and systemic reforms within the Boston Police Department, including but not limited to those articulated by the Mayor's Task Force on Police Reform. The Mayor has moved swiftly to see those reforms implemented by signing 2 executive orders, the first creating a civilian review board and the second establishing the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel. In addition, now pending before the Council is an ordinance to establish the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency and imbue these entities with subpoena power. As always, if the Council has general questions regarding the Commonwealth's collective bargaining law, the procedure of the Joint Labor Management Committee, or the civil service law as it relates to police officers that it wishes to have answered, please forward them to me and we will provide written responses while respecting the requirement that attorneys maintain the confidentiality of client communications, strategies, and materials. Respectfully, Emma Handy, Chief Financial Officer, Collector Treasurer, Chief Admin and Finance. So that's the administration's letter. I think I said at our previous hearing on this topic that I have familiarized myself with the law in regard to fair bargaining standards and making sure that the administration is not being unfair to its counterparties or to itself. And I feel quite confident that the administration could come and speak to us about the policy priorities and expectations guiding their collective bargaining strategy vis-a-vis the police contracts without running afoul of any of that. Obviously, this is a different interpretation, but that is where we find ourselves. So that's the letter that I sent. I want to, I thought I would structure our conversation today, and I should say we'll be joined in a little bit by co-sponsor Councillor Edwards, and I'll give her the opportunity to make a few comments then. But I made an effort over the weekend to think a little bit about some of the main themes that have been emerging, both from our council hearing on the contract and from these overtime hearings we've been having. And if folks look at the document that I sent over, I kind of put the 4 up top, and then some examples of ways that they, I think, would cash out in policy expectations from the council for this contract. And I think it's really important to stress that so many of the keys to, the types of things that are being mentioned in the police reform task force recommendations, actually to have purchase, they need purchase in the contract. Like executive orders are good, but they don't actually get you there in terms of full accountability. And when we talk about fiscal controls, you could do so much with fiscal oversight, but at some point, the fundamentals of how the contract is structured, like Councillor Arroyo said, just come into play. So I just think we really can't highlight enough how much all of those public policy concerns that are the council's proper territory are tied up in this document. So just very briefly going to summarize these 4 and then maybe move one by one and kind of talk with councilors, and again, soliciting sort of feedback, input, thoughts. So the first issue that's come up again and again is sort of fiscal responsibility and fairness to all city workers. And I think this is important because so many of us on the council weren't here in 2016, but the council unanimously sent a letter after signing off on a public safety contract for the detectives then, saying that really, we have as a city created a widening pay disparity between our public safety unions and our civilian city employees. It was really broken very wide open by a arbitration award that came from the state in 2013, such that for 6 years we saw our police officers enjoy a 25.4% pay increase, while our civilian workforce was receiving a 12.3% one. And then it was compounded in the last round of negotiations by the fact that we increased police hazard pay, which is a category that doesn't exist, obviously, for other workers. And so the challenge here is that, as we all know, because we deal with these budget trade-offs every year, it's a zero-sum pie. The city's bound by its balanced budget rules to spend, the same total number of dollars. And so the issue is that, in the context of a recession where we've got impacts on the city's tax base that are going to be felt for years, and that balanced budget requirement, we really have this duty to Boston residents to only approve fiscally responsible contracts, and to our civilian city employees to ensure that the financial impacts of tighter budgets be shared fairly across all units. And so I think actually I'll touch on a couple of sub points in that and then maybe open up the floor. So within that, some of the things that I've suggested that I think the council should be setting as expectations. One is that the council should expect that the new round of police contracts will narrow this disparity with civilian pay, not continue to widen it. It's really, as we said in our 2016 letter, escalating public safety salaries have squeezed out other city positions. And I think we really need to move in the opposite direction. Another thing that came up quite a bit, particularly with the questioning from Councillor O'Malley and Councillor Arroyo in our overtime hearing a couple of weeks back, is that we have a lot of shifts that are structured such that folks are going to need to do overtime on a routine basis. So if you work nights and then you also go regularly to court, all that court's going to be overtime. If you work days, but you're a community service officer and you go to evening meetings, all those evening meetings are going to be overtime. And there's actually a provision in our contract right now that forbids adjusting shifts in order to minimize overtime. But I think actually overtime, right, the reason we have this rule about public safety overtime overages is because there are genuinely unanticipatable aspects of public safety work. But those kinds of routine things are not they. So I think that's something that we should have an expectation that the contract adjusts. And then the ability to kind of overall achieve financial efficiencies, tighten up issues around overtime and other provisions, such that if we'd had the new contract in the old time, we would have saved significant funds. Because when we think about redeploying it, whether it's officer health and safety, Councillor Flynn, or these alternative civilian options that we've talked about standing up, everything costs money. And so any efficiencies we can find to achieve public safety in these other ways we're discussing is important. And then the fourth thing that I mentioned in my memo was that we've seen this huge uptick. This was really explored at our November hearing, but the uptick in injured, sort of like long-term injured and sick officers is enormous over the last 21 months. It's gone up 71% from 158, which was pretty stable before, to like 270. And most of that increase is prior to COVID. And so that is, having a 10th of the force out at any one time is not a new normal that we can come to live with in our department. It's not something that we could work with in any other department. And so I think that's something where we've got to, look for both contract and policy responses to get that under control. So those are some of the things that fell to me under that first bucket of kind of the council's fiscal responsibility and the responsibility to our civilian units, that we really recognize that we don't want to increase that pay gap, that we push to kind of get rid of like routine sources of overtime kind of baked into our structures, and try to make financial efficiencies across the board in the way that overtime is structured. Councilor Royals raised a bunch of these good points related to court, and then really try to control. The Councillor Flynn, to your point about additional police officers, I mean, the department reported to us that they're replacing about 94 officers worth of work a day. That's driving our overtime costs in a huge way. That increase in the number of officers out, sick, injured on full pay is up by 112 in the last 21 months. So that's an enormous kind of loss of sworn personnel out on the street already within our existing structure. So those are some of the things kind of in that first bucket. And I think maybe what I'll do is throw it open to blue hands. Since this is a working session, we'll do it a little more informally. So if any counselors have comments on that first category, I'll take blue hands. And then while people are thinking, I'll just say for anyone watching at home that if you're interested, we will post it. But if you want the memo that I'm talking about, if you email ccc.wm, so that's WM for Ways and Means, ccc.wm@boston.gov, you can get a copy if you're watching us from home. Anyone have any comments on that first category? I don't know if, Councillor Campbell, I'm not putting you on the spot, but well, I'll ask. If at some point in this you want to talk a little bit about the context of the 2016 letter, that'd be great. But any comments? All right. If not, I'll just jump to the next thing and then we can, Councillor Roy. Oh, yeah.
Madam Chair, really quickly, what was the first thing in that? Because there were a couple points in that, so I'm just trying to figure out what the first galvanizing point is there that you're referring to as the first point.
Yeah. So if do you have the document open or not?
Yes.
So basically what I'm saying is if you look, so at the top of on page 1, there's a number 1, which is fiscal responsibility and fairness to all city workers.
So the pay parity, is that basically what you're referring to right now?
Right. So, but if you see it, it's basically like the top of the memo has that topic 1. And then, yeah, when you go down to the second page, you get into like 4 things, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, that are subsets of it.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're looking at.
So the first thing is the pay parity point, is just really underlining that, you know, we've got a huge number of city workers who are, you know, civilian, and we want, like our police officers, right? They're frontline in a different way. And we want to be making sure that our contracts with one category aren't crowding out our contracts with the others.
Okay. I see how I just wanted to see how we were going to frame the rest of this hearing, is basically framing it by 1, 2, 3. Is that basically how you want to do it?
Yeah, that was kind of what I was thinking, just because since the administration's not here to answer questions, it seemed like a way to structure it. So yeah, and to that point, I don't know. So I think just to me, the 1, 2, 3, 4, right, are this overall fiscal responsibility point about making, about making smart and responsible fiscal decisions vis-a-vis the police budget. Then there's an accountability for use of force and abuse of power bucket. There's a bunch of conversations about civilianization of civilian work. And then I think there's transparency issues. And each of these have hooks that if we don't set expectations about how the contract's going to change, the contract's not necessarily hospitable to them. So that's sort of, yeah, that's kind of my mental organization, Councillor Royo. But I don't know if you have any comments in that first category.
The one thing I would say about this, because I think, you know, for people who are listening to this, for people who may be in uniform and are wondering why we're discussing their contract specifically, I think it's really important to understand a couple of things. The first one for me is that in 2013, I believe it was 2013, similar to 2016, there was an approval of a budget of a contract, and there was a conversation around the fact that that contract was fiscally basically not that responsible, that we were going to be seeing a situation where with inflation, with rising costs, this was going to crowd out other things. And I think it's really important for folks to understand that when we talk about our city budget, it's not an infinite pot, right? We have a specific set of money, the money that unfortunately is going to go down due to the situation we're dealing with right now. And from that money, we pay all kinds of folks. We pay, our garbage collectors, we pay our teachers, we pay our civilian workforce at City Hall that does things like food access, and our public health commission, all these different things that we are putting money into our small business relief fund. And more of one thing to another creates pretty large disparity. And for me, the way I look at this, and I think this is similar to the way that I am interpreting this letter looks at this, some of this money can be better used in different ways and might actually result in an equal outcome or better outcomes for city residents. And so when, I think about how we have this conversation, I don't think about this as, anti-police, which I think is how some folks have tried to turn this narrative about discussing police contracts into some sort of punishment or some sort of, anti-police rhetoric. The reality is it's just good budgeting. It's just smart to look at something that is taking a large portion of our city budget and asking whether or not that makes sense, whether or not that measurably creates the outcomes that we are seeking, a safer city, a healthier city, and whether or not that is actually crowding out other things like our school funding, like our all of these other different things that the city finances, and not trying to pit one person versus another person or one city worker versus another city worker and say this service is more valuable than that service. Because if we found anything in this pandemic, it's that a lot of essential services were not the essential services that maybe the general public believed were quote unquote essential going into a pandemic, right? Our frontline workers turned into folks who work in grocery stores, folks who were doing garbage disposal, folks who were doing all these different jobs. And so, I just want to be very clear when we do this, that it's not anti-police as much as it's trying to fiscally get a contract that actually reflects the values of the city and actually reflects what I think is a better use of our funds all across the board, because this pot is limited. It's a finite pot. It doesn't just, increase. And so the way we use this money has to be fiscally responsible, but it also should be getting the most for our city residents. And so that's basically all I have to say on the first point. And just to say that the history of this is clear. Like 2016, there was a letter, but in 2013, the council, even though it unanimously was affirmed, spoke out against the contract for the increases that it had. And so this is a 7-year strong situation. And I think what I understand this to be, for me at least, is I don't want to be in another situation where the council is again saying this was a fiscally irresponsible contract, but here we are. Right. And so that's, I think, what we're trying to avoid. So that's all I have on that point.
Absolutely. Yes. No, thank you, Councilor Arroyo. The point is very much, I think that the council reluctantly accepted that award in 2013. It was from the Joint Labor Management Committee, which is a state body where public safety contracts go for negotiation if they don't reach agreement around the table. And so then it came back, and the administration, when the JLMC decides something, they have to support it. And so the only potential check was for the council to vote it down. And the council chose not to vote it down in that instance. And then the reason why we were having the same conversation in 2016 is that the public safety contracts tend to move in unison. So basically, once this very large increase was agreed for the patrolman's contract, it was only a matter of time for it to ripple through the other contracts. And so we have both that happening with the whole set of police contracts, and there's also a tendency for the police and fire ones to kind of track each other in terms of increases. And so that's part of what has driven up this, as Councilor Arroyo was saying, really unsustainable gap between our sworn workforces and our civilian ones. And I think just for people to get their head around it, right? The overtime budget in 2010 for the city of Boston was $40 million. And last year it was $72.5 million. So that's an 81% increase. In that time, that same 10-year period, inflation has been 19%. So that means that the overtime budget for the police department has increased over this decade by more than 4 times inflation. Meanwhile, our civilian departments have tended to track inflation fairly closely. So that is very much the gap that we're talking about. And it really is, it's why we're having this conversation in Ways and Means. And it's really a question, unfortunately, of fairly zero-sum trade-off some of the time. And our job as policymakers is to think about what's the best use of each city taxpayer dollar. Any other comments on on this, on the sort of fiscal reform?
No, Councilor Bach, I just wanted to thank Councilor Royal for some of that framing, because I know obviously with any of the conversations around policing reform, it has been at moments, there are some who choose to frame it as an us versus them, or the devaluing of our individual officers and the work they do as dedicated city employees. So I appreciated what he added there, and of course what you added. So just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
I may have to jump early as I continue conversations related to our working session on the Civilian Review Board.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, well, that relates to the
Yes.
the second topic, which was just to say, you know, which in my memo I titled "Accountability for Use of Force and Abuse of Power." Basically, the Civilian Review Board, as proposed by Councillor Campbell and Arroyo and Mejia, is that right? Did I get the co-sponsors on that?
That's right.
Great.
Oh, and separately, can you also send the letter that you read from the administration? I'm not sure that all of us have actually received that.
Well, I just
sent it
that
to you.
Michelle is sending it over as we speak.
Thank you.
So the both that Civilian Review Board and the version that's been proposed in the Boston Police Reform Task Force recommendations to the mayor, both end up with you know, disciplinary recommendations, including, right, sometimes termination being made to the police commissioner. The tricky thing is that we actually have a situation in Boston contractually where all of our discipline and discharge goes through the grievance and arbitration process functionally, and it ends in binding arbitration. And the upshot of that process has been that I think in the last, since the 2007 contract, so in the last 13 years, about 3/4 of disciplinary actions and a third or a half, sorry, I'm forgetting, I think it's maybe a third of terminations have been overturned in that binding arbitration process. And so when you look at how to have a more transparent, citizen involved process that kind of really, you know, gives people confidence about accountability, a thing which I think, to your point, Councillor Campbell, is something that's good for police. It's something that is good for just, you know, trust in our whole civil society. It's one thing for us to set up an apparatus to do that. But if that apparatus ends up proposing a bunch of discipline that then never gets carried out because our contract is stymieing it, I think we're in a very frustrating situation democratically. And and it was interesting when I went back and dug, there was a provision in the 1979 police contract that basically said, oh, well, obviously grievance and arbitration is for, you know, it's for disputes about lunch breaks and uniforms and all kinds of, you know, things about work conditions. But when it comes to discipline and discharge, that's going to be handled separately, and not have grievance and arbitration proceedings apply in the same way. And then by the 2007 contract, that line had been taken out. And so because of that, we've really run through, there's a discipline and discharge section, Article 5, I think, I don't have in front of me, of the BPBA contract, but then in practice, grievance and arbitration is what it all runs through. And grievance and arbitration is a great mechanism for resolving all kinds of disputes. But the absolute primacy of binding arbitration, when you have a really serious use of force case and the police commissioner has made a determination that there's a need for termination, and maybe in a future situation, a Civilian Review Board has backed that up, to have that overturned by an arbitrator, I think is going to send us in the wrong direction. So one thing that I feel very strongly about, and that's, you know, in this committee right now, being agnostic about exactly what that mechanism looks like, you know, is that whatever that mechanism is that we pass, that it actually have teeth and purchase in the contract. So that's sort of the second category of things to me. I don't know if anyone else has comments on that, or if Councillor Campbell, you want to say something. I know you have to go do more work on that front shortly. May have actually just gone to do that, so. Any other comments on that kind of? Councillor Arroyo, you're also a co-sponsor. I don't know if you had any. thoughts on this issue?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just say, as we look at this issue, it seems like, and this is somewhere where it seems like the administration also agrees that there has to be some metric of accountability, some way to do this beyond what currently exists. Because the reality is, there is no city employee who has the kind of powers that an officer has. Does not. Trial 4 unfortunately showed what happens when those powers can sort of go unchecked. And I recognize that was the 90s and we're now in 2020. But unfortunately, for many officers who have been found responsible for bad behavior, whether it's overtime fraud, whether it's an abuse of power in some way, they're still on the force. And those are the kinds of things where when you're dealing with the public trust, when you're dealing with the kinds of powers that officers have to take life, to physically put their hands on a resident. Those are powers we just don't have in other offices, and it requires the highest level of oversight and accountability. And I think that's something that I would like to see the city move closer to, and I think we're actually moving closer to that. And so this, to me, is a no-brainer when we talk about the collective bargaining and how we do this, because I know that frustration of the inability to move officers that the commissioner and other officers believe should not still be, employed, has been a real issue moving forward. I would hope that we can create a way to make that easier. And I don't know if the Civilian Review Board is going to do that, but I do think that the CBA that's currently being discussed should certainly do that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and we've had so many successive police commissioners be frustrated by the effort to, terminating an officer and then having them come back and then also owing them an immense amount of back pay. And I think that one of the things that I've certainly heard from a number of police officers is that, when you have somebody who has transgressed in a way that, leads to termination, like it's not somebody who you want to be your partner, right? We want to have a professional force where those decisions are upheld. So I just think it's really important. I see Councilor Mejia. Councilor Mejia?
Just wanted to let you know that I was here back, and I wasn't sure if there was an opportunity to ask some questions. The administration is not here. I don't know who we're going to ask these questions to, but I figured I do have some things that I'd like to share whenever it's my turn. I stepped out, so I wasn't sure where we were.
Yeah. So if you want, I think what I would say is obviously the admin has not joined us, but obviously they invited us in their letter to send them questions. And so I think if there are questions that you want to get on the record, I'm thinking of this in some ways kind of like those working sessions that we did in budget where we came up with questions and then we forwarded them for follow-up. So if you have questions that you want to raise now, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. So I think so. I'm just curious as what would an ordinance around changing policy contracts to policy documents look like? And how can we explain it to people in a way that they can actually understand? Because I'm still a little bit unclear on that. So maybe Councilor Bach, you can help us understand that. And then in the last hearing on this issue, I asked one of the panelists if they thought there was room for the people or the representatives of the people in police contracts. And there seems to be a desire for the voices of the people to take a more involved role in policy reform as it relates to this issue. And how can we find ways to bring community voices into the space in a more intentional way?
Awesome. Yeah, so a few thoughts on that. One is definitely, I've also heard that, I think there's a strong interest among some community members to have, could we have these be open bargaining sessions that we all get to watch? Or could we have community members in the room, which is something they've tried in some jurisdictions in other states? Or could we at a minimum, and it certainly seems to me like that, this could be possible. Could we at a minimum, know when the sessions are happening and what the main issues on the table are and sort of things that allow people to express themselves in a timely way and bring pressure and articulate kind of what folks' demands are. I think the challenge we face with that is that we can't make open bargaining a demand of the council, because the state's fair labor laws basically require that, like, you can have an open bargaining session, but both sides have to agree, and like neither side can like require the other side to do it. So I think that for us as the city's council, it's not something we could kind of demand that all the parties at the table do, but that doesn't mean it's not something that the public could call upon the parties to do. And I think that it's really interesting to imagine. I think the point of this whole conversation is that so much public policy is tied up in these contracts, and the idea of actually talking about them in public, would be, I think, really transformative. So that's just some thoughts from me on that one, but I think that's something I've also heard Councilor Mejia, a lot of people articulate. And in terms of how to make it, relatable and communicate about it, I think that, I think that some of the advocacy groups we hear from have done a great job, like getting their members reading the contract and digging into the details. And we know that a lot of our community members are ready to show up in that way. I think that, though, this is one of the tricky pieces for us as counselors, is that the devil's in the details with contracts. And so how do you really drill down and focus on those things and still make it easy to communicate? I sent you guys a 6-page detailed memo. It's not a great like 1-page, like, here are the main points type thing. Because this is a very, you're talking about a 1/10 of the city budget, right? And so, and a ton of very specific provisions that govern how it gets spent. So I don't know, that might be a question to turn back to you, Councilor Mejia, for more, for new ideas.
Yeah, so I'm curious about what the difference is between the BTU and the BPD, because I feel, and maybe it's because I worked in the education space, but there is a lot of community input and processes that are put in place for those conversations. And what can we learn from the way the BTU engages the public in their processes? And is that a model for BPD to look into and consider? Because regardless of whether or not, I understand labor law, I don't understand labor laws. I understand we have some restrictions around these situations, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is that these are public dollars, and the public should have a voice in how these dollars are allocated. And I'm still struggling with why we can't.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're trying to create a forum for. And that is, and I think the public's voice is importantly what council ratification is designed to represent. And which is imperfect. And it comes too much at the end of these processes, which is why we're trying to have this conversation more at the beginning. But to your point about BTU, and I'll go back to you in a sec. I think that there definitely are, there's a big community labor movement pushing for kind of more close connection, like you say, between some of the types of things that labor is asking for at the table and community interest, because, laborers live in our community, they're one and the same, right? And so with, like, for instance, right, the fight to have a social worker, to have a nurse in every school, like those have been things that BTU has taken up. And I think similarly, it's an interesting question. I think you talk about often about sort of calling people in instead of calling them out. I think that it's a great opportunity for us, and it's the same thing with kind of open bargaining and community conversation. It's a great time for us to invite the BPPA and the detectives, the superior officer, like, into a conversation with the public. And the tricky thing for us with that is that we can't, because as the council, we vote on these agreements, like, we can't convene that conversation as the council. So, like, you'll know, like, I would love to invite our police unions to come and have this conversation with us at hearings, but we can't do that because of these rules. But that doesn't mean that the public and our police officers can't be having these conversations about how to have contracts that work well for everybody. So I think it's a good point.
So my last 2 things one is going back to what Councillor Flynn was alluding to in terms of the social and emotional and mental well-being of our police officers. When we think about these contract negotiations, I think that those are sort of things that we also need to be super mindful of in terms of people being overworked. And then we look at what the police officer's role is, and oftentimes they're asked to do 100 other things that are not part of the job description. So, you know, there's just some things that we need to look into to see, you know, how we can eat that elephant and cut it up a little bit so that maybe we allocate some of those resources into other areas that can help support other issues, and then they can focus on their jobs, right? So I just think something worth looking into. And then the last piece that I will say, as it relates to all of this contracting and negotiating pieces, is that this happens during a mayoral race, right? It's every 4 years the situation happens, right? Right or no?
Well, no, the contracts are on an every 3-year cycle. So they happen to be the same year as an election year this year, but
so it doesn't always fall in within the mayor. Okay, I'm just me making assumptions, but nonetheless, this is a very political issue, right? And what it does, it just takes something that is impacting people and politicizing it even further. So I also think that when these conversations happen, need to be reevaluated as well. I think we should be doing this every year, not every 3 years. We need to dive into these contracts every year. Or do we? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think the advantage of the 3 years is that then you're not in constant negotiation. But I think obviously the disadvantage is that then you're locked in. So if there's, you know, something, if the policy issue comes up that you want to change, you can't change it easily outside of the 3-year term. But so that's one of the advantages this year of being in the moment of having these conversations.
So when you say the administration couldn't be here, not even so the BPD would be part of the, like, so
I think it's important for folks at home just to know that the parties in the negotiation are actually the city administration is represented by the Office of Labor Relations. And then they have some support through BPD command staff who know about the department issues, but the same labor relations team negotiates all of the contracts for the city, right? I mean, they might mix people in and out, but they're negotiating contracts across the board. So that's why we got the letter today from Emma Handy, our CFO, who's over the OLR office. And then the people on the other side of the table are not BPD, the department, they're the police unions, right? So the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, and the Detectives Benevolent Society, which has 2 different unions, and then the superior officers. So that's who's on the other side of the table.
Thank you for that. No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And I want to immediately, to your point, Councillor Mejia, I think that's the next bucket of things that we have to think about in the contract are these opportunities, as you say, to sort of cut up the elephant, shift some of the civilian work that we've kind of put on our police officers' laps to civilians, and kind of break down some of that burden and hopefully improve public safety outcomes on all fronts. But before turning to that, I just wanted to check, we were joined by Council President Kim Janey, and I don't know, President Janey, if you wanted to say any words, just because we did do opening remarks. Madam President? Oh, you know what? She's looks like having a connection issue. So I will jump to this third category and then. So there are really 3 groups of civilianization proposals that we've heard over the last few months. One of them is actually from the department itself. It talked about the fact that right now there's about 80 to 100 sworn officers in administrative, like sort of, desk jobs, as they say. And that obviously those are folks with police training, and that civilianizing some of those positions could offer an opportunity to get some of those folks back on the street doing police work. And so the department referenced the fact that it wanted long-term to try to move towards civilianizing many of those 80 to 100 spots, which again, 80 to 100 spots, and you think about the fact that we're paying overtime to replace about 94 police officers worth of folks each day, that would make a big, big difference to the force that we have available. So to make a number of those changes, you actually have to change the contract, because in some places the contract has specifically called out a number of desk jobs that are going to be designated. And there's a large number, 32 of those 100 are in the detail system assignment. So we've got 32 police officers who are spread out throughout the districts whose job is to assign detail shifts to other officers. And that seems like something that both could be civilianized and could probably be centralized, which is a conversation the department's been having since the early 90s. But so that's one category of civilianization. Another is related to those details. We saw at the hearing a couple weeks ago that about half of the details that have come to the police department in the last 10 months, so about 26,000 of them, have gone unfilled. So that means officers have opted not to fill them. And when that happens, they don't, obviously there's no one there, and the city doesn't get the administrative fee, no one gets paid for it, but they're places where legally the companies are, whether it's utilities, developers, et cetera, obligated to pay for a flagger. And so it's raised the really important question of, if we've got this many details going unfilled, why are we not filling those construction details with civilian flaggers and offering a really good job to a bunch of potential city workers? Could come from our communities, could come from our communities of color. It could really create some quality jobs for people. And given the fact that so many are going untaken, that's even separate from the question of whether some of the construction details that are currently performed by the police would be, whether again, it might be a better use of civilian work to do that. Because I think that, one of the things that we certainly heard from people is, there's a shortage of work in my community. I see folks in my community on these jobs who, they're not necessarily knowing people, they're not part of the community. And is there an opportunity here to change that dynamic? And it was about 10 years ago that we made it sort of theoretically possible to do that in the state of Massachusetts, but it hasn't tended to happen. But I think the fact that we've got so many details going unfilled creates a really interesting opportunity to investigate that. But doing that, even opening the way for civilians to take those unfilled detail shifts, would require changes in the contract, because the contract currently only has a mechanism to funnel all details, construction and other, to police officers. And so thinking about a way to set up some kind of alternative system where the police commissioner has the ability to designate some of those details for civilians outside of the police department, I think is something we should be thinking about and talking about, and that that's something that we've got strong advocates on the outside calling for. And then the third thing, and then I'll open up again. The third category of civilianization is really, we've been talking on this council about a potential alternative 911 response for some calls, for medical calls, mental health, just lots of things where it might be that the right person to show up is a social worker, mental health professional, or another type of responder, someone with housing access, rather than a police officer. And that's something, there's a hearing order that was filed by counselors Wu, Edwards, and Mejia, I think, for a 911 alternative civilian response. And then also it's something that's actually called for that kind of consideration in the mayor's Boston Police Reform Task Force recommendations. And we've heard actually a lot of police officers and police command folks talk about how they've really transformed their work working with social service providers and others and with the best teams, and they would love to see some of that work transfer over more fully to these types of service providers. So I think as a city, we're sort of on the cusp of getting into that, and it's really important. It can't come soon enough. And yet we have to make sure that our contract is going to allow for it, because in the past, every time that as a city, we've tried to stand up sort of alternative response things, and there's actually articles going back to the 60s and 70s in Mattapan, folks trying to set up neighborhood civilian patrols. There's been pushback based on a police contract kind of giving exclusive patrolling and response work to police. So I think that having that conversation in a context where a lot of officers are also saying that this is important is a really important thing. We don't want to all be moving in that direction together and then find that the contracts are what hold us back. So those are a couple categories of civilianization, sort of the details, the 911 response, and then just these desk jobs in the department that I think have all come up in our conversations. I'll open the floor for comments on that, but first I did just want to give Council President Janey a chance to make a comment if she wished, because I think it looks like your connectivity is better.
Yes, thank you so much. I am joining late, as you can see. And so at this point, I think I want to continue to listen and follow along and then catch up on what I missed prior to. But thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you, Madam President. All right. So on the civilianization fronts, any comments from anyone?
Hey, Councilor Bach. I was listening to the conversation, but I do know that opening up that to civilian flaggers, it also takes a police officer off the street. But I think the bigger point is, I think we need to have a conversation about, hiring more police officers is part of the discussion, is part of the answer. And I think with all these retirements that we're having and potentially having over the next year, I know I've said it before, but I think we really need to have 300 or 400 new police officers join the department. I've talked to a lot of spouses of police officers over the last year, listened to them, and they are concerned about the police officers being overworked. Sometimes we know the number of hours they're working, but a healthy police officer is a professional police officer. And not only do we need to look at hiring more police officers, we need to make sure that police officers and their families have the medical and mental health counseling available, because that's a very difficult job, as we all know. And, getting that needed care for you and your family is critical. If you're working 14, 15 hours a day, 6 days a week, you don't have any time to spend with your spouse or your children, you're missing out a lot of family events. But I think it's having a toll. I think it's having a toll on our department. I think it's unfair it's unfair to the police officers as well. But I think making sure, and nationally, Councilor Bach, we also, as we all know, we have a high suicide rate of police officers. I know Commissioner Gross has been working on that issue along with Commissioner Evans prior to him. But that's a concern nationally as well. But I think we really need to go back and have a serious discussion about health issues, mental health for our police officers and their families. It's critical. It's part of the discussion. And I think, I think that during these collective bargaining, which I support 100%, I'm a strong supporter of our unions. But that has to be a critical part of it, is the health and wellness of our police families. And as I mentioned before, a healthy police officer is an effective police officer. We need to give our police officers the chance, the time, the access to the medical care that they deserve and earn. Because when I came back from a deployment, several deployments, it had a huge impact on me and my family. It took me a while to readjust back to society, back to civilian life. And I think a lot of our police officers, because they see so much trauma every day, are dealing with that issue as well. So we need to acknowledge that, but also provide them some services, programs, time off, so that they can be effective at their job. I hope that information is helpful. I know it's not is not part of the discussion that we've been focused on, but I think it really needs to be part of collective bargaining going forward. Thank you, Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Mejia?
So, Councilor Bach, do we have a job description for the Boston police officer? Because I just Googled it. I can't find one.
I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know about that, but we can certainly ask the department. I mean, there's police exams and stuff for entry into the department, so it's not like people just answer a listing, but they've got to have an appropriate job description that's part of like an HR function. So
Yeah, so I'm curious to Councilor Flynn's point in terms of just the overwork and how it impacts the social, emotional, and mental well-being of police officers. I think that we need to look at what is the function of a police officer in Boston. And we need to do a deep dive of that job description. And if there isn't one, then we need to seize this moment to create one, or to support them in creating one. I don't think we can write it for them, but I just think that there needs to be a job description. I can't believe I Googled it, and maybe some people have better Googling skills than me, but I can't find a job description. There's like Boston Police Department, Heel Boston. There's like law enforcement officers for federal bank reserves, like this, all this, but I haven't seen one. There's requirements, which I understand what you need to have. I just still need to know what your function is. So I think having a job description would be helpful. So if you could add that to the list of things that we'd like to see. And I'm just curious in terms of if there is a job description, I'm wondering how often police officers are able to look at that job description and say, oh, that's not my job, but I have to do it anyways, right? I'd like to know if there's a dashboard of how many times police officers are assuming roles that have nothing to do with what they signed up to do, which is being the case manager, the housing advocate, the mental health service provider. So when you think about the question about civilianizing some of these functions, I think that that is an ample opportunity for us to dive deep into that, so that police officers can serve what their role is, and that those other roles that they are assuming we can parcel off to civilians. I think that that could be a way to address this particular issue that we're having a conversation about today.
yeah. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. No, I agree. I think that to Councilor Flynn's point about health and wellness, I think it's much easier to feel okay in a job if you feel like supported and like part of a team where there are other people who are doing the other things. And I think it's tough when we throw police officers at every social challenge that we have. I also want to recognize that we were joined a while ago by Councilor Asabi George. And let's see. Any other comments on this, on these, the sort of threefold, the civilianization questions around? I think, Councilor Flynn, to your point about folks on the street, I mean, I think to me, part of the opportunity here, first of all, is that, right, we've got these like 26,000 details that are going unfilled. So nobody's in those roles right now. But also I think that while I hear the argument about, a police officer who's doing a detail might also witness a crime or something, and maybe, and actually I'm sure that happens some of the time. I also think that we all know that like often people are having conversations, neighborhoods are having conversations with the police about places that they'd like there to be a fixed post, and the chances that that place lines up perfectly where someone happens to be building a tall building, it seems like most of the time it's not going to work out that way. So to me, I do think of kind of the police work that we want officers doing and the flagging sort of construction safety management work that I think really a flagger is for, in some sense, as being a bit distinctive, to Councillor Mejia's point, but I recognize there's kind of differences of opinion on that front. I see, Councillor Mejia, is your hand just still up from before, or did you? Oh, Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to go on record as being in support of the civilianization of these jobs. The reality is, touching on what Councillor Flynn said about overworking, the reality is we know that if we had jobs like these that were civilianized, we would actually be able to repurpose those officers into these other roles that we're now currently using replacement hours on, that we're currently understaffed on. And, I think ultimately when we talk about civilianization, I haven't heard a fantastic reason for why these aren't civilian jobs. I haven't heard like a super great reason why this couldn't be done by a civilian. I've obviously heard, I remember when this was done back under the Deval Patrick administration, there was some, or attempted to be done, there was some conversation about, officers at details also are officers still. And so there was a couple, I can't remember the numbers, but there was some number of arrests or cases that had been generated from traffic detail stops. But the reality is, I don't actually know what the metrics would be there that a flagger couldn't ensure safety, that a civilian flagger couldn't do many of the same functions. And so when we look at that and we look at more of the administrative aspects of BPD, I would certainly be in favor of making sure that's a civilian workforce. I think that's fiscally responsible, but also it allows our officers to do what they can do best, the things that only they can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Arroyo. Councillor Mejia, sorry, just checking if that was a hand back up.
Yeah, so no, no, I will wait till the other.
Okay. Any other comments on this kind of the third bucket here?
I just wanted to ask a question. When you go from a civilian, go towards more of a civilian police force, and downsize the sworn officers to civilian, are you then going into a situation where you're doing more privatization of union jobs or of the workforce? And what other agencies or departments would we do that in? Or is this just a one-time thing that, like all of you, I'm a strong supporter of organized labor, and one of the issues I've been dealing with is at the hotel with you, Council Block, with the hotel, the Four Seasons, and with the Marriott at Copley. Those are they're laying off their workforce, and I bet you they're going to lay that workforce off and then bring people in that at a lower wage, less benefits, and they don't have the training. I think the training is part of it too. So do we run into that type of dynamic when we begin to privatize or downsize and then hire people to do the job at a lower wage? That's concerning to me.
So I would just say, Councillor Flynn, that obviously the police department has substantial numbers of civilians who work for it already, just in various civilian functions in the department, and they're unionized employees and they're city employees, right? And so I strongly agree with you. I would not want to see us privatizing our city workforce, and I don't think that civilianization and privatization are not the same thing. I think that, and I think to your point about kind of hiring more police officers, I think part of the point of what I'm saying is that we're replacing these 94 officers worth of work with overtime each day right now, but we've got 100 officers who are trained and are, and who we're paying commensurate with their skills as police officers, right? With hazard pay, recognizing that they've like pursued this police career, we've got 100 of them on desk jobs as we replace these 94 spots with overtime. And then we've also got a really concerning number of officers out on this long-term injured and sick leave, and a number that has increased by 71% in less than 2 years. So it feels like we have actually quite a lot of sworn police officer workforce that right now, unfortunately, we're not able to use for doing some of that police work. And so I think that, to me, the idea of having civilian workers in administrative civilian jobs, workers who would be well-paid city union employees. And I think to your point that if we were talking about civilian flaggers, we should be thinking about good, city jobs, like that, in the same way as the city right now runs the detail system for police officers. You would take some of those slots that are going unfilled and you would fill them with, city workers who are flaggers. And it might address some of our other issues where sometimes people just want somebody to stand and kind of, be in a situation to help make sure that that the traffic around a site is safe, right? I think that, like, so that's just to say, I just would say that I strongly share your concerns about privatization, and certainly it's not something that that I'm ever going to advocate for. But yeah.
No, thank you, Councilor Bach.
So I do now have a question before we move on. Is that okay, Councilor Bach?
What this is for. Yes.
So I also agree with Councilor Flynn. I always talk about the fact that my mom is 71 years old and too poor to retire because she's never had union representation. So I think it's really important for us to frame this conversation not as an or, but an and. And when we expand and create opportunities for civilians to step into these roles, that we do so in a way that is going to ensure dignity, respect, the right compensation, and the representation. I think, where this gets a little bit tricky for me is the who is representing them in a union, right? I think that the reason why we're having this conversation is because there's just a lot of political tension between the police unions. So I think this could be an opportunity for us to build and create work for those folks who right now are underemployed. And we can do so in a way that is not privatizing the workforce, but that we are being really intentional about how we go about doing it, is what I'd like to advocate for.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Yeah, and just to put some numbers on the thing, like, if you think about, the way I think about it is we've got 26,000 details that went unfilled in the last 10 months. If you multiply those, they have to be a minimum of 4 hours. If you multiply those by 4, and then you say somebody could have made a $40 an hour wage, you're talking about $4.5 million that the city could have taken from private developers and utility companies and others, right, doing work to create good jobs in our city. And right now, if we don't fill the detail, the work just goes forward without one. So I just think it's important to note that I think is a real opportunity here, like you say, to kind of grow the pie of like good jobs in the city and also make the overall situation safer. Councilor Arroyo, is that hand back up? Sorry, I lost track.
Nope, that's just stayed up.
Yeah, blue hands. You feel it in your shoulder if you keep up the real ones, but okay. Then I think just jump into this fourth category. And again, just for anyone watching at home, if you did want to look at this memo, it's available if you email ccc.wm@boston.gov. We'll get it sent to you. We'll have it posted up online. But the sort of fourth category bucket is transparency, enhancing and ensuring public trust. So I think that this has come up a bunch actually in the police reform task force conversations, and some of what has been called for there is going to require contract change or could require contract change. So one thing is kind of a conversation about universalizing body cameras. So we've had a very successful body camera pilot, but we still don't have all units wearing them. And then as folks know, we don't have a requirement for folks to wear them during overtime, but overtime is a lot of our policing. So that's, so that's like an obvious thing that we would hope that would be addressed in the next contract negotiations. And then another couple things are kind of sharing all the information that's provided to the unions with the public as well. So Councillor Arroyo raised the issue of minimum staffing levels and the fact that it's been quite hard for us to sort of get those from the department and get a sense of what those look like across the city. But the reality is that, every shift schedule, every shift vacancy, all overtime postings, et cetera, all the orders, all the seniority lists, these are all shared with the unions. And it seems like something that if the department's sharing them with the labor representatives, they could also be sharing them with the public and kind of just making the overall distribution of the city police force on a sort of typical day more transparent to people. And then another thing is that the task force is called for the sharing of a lot of sort of important use of force and sensitive officer conduct data, disaggregated geographically and by race and ethnicity. And obviously the contract shouldn't include any provisions that are going to prevent us from having that sort of data transparency. So I don't know if anyone has comments on that, on the transparency front. And then Councilor Arroyo reminded me that screen share exists, so I might throw up this memo just so people can visually see it. But first off, Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I was having difficulty logging in and hearing the conversation just a little bit ago, so I will watch this session at another time. But I am curious on all of these areas and categories, other than the hearing order as it was filed, do we have some of this sort of documented and any of these conversations that we've had so far to date with sort of suggested edits and modifications to it? Is there any sort of document to review based on the conversation so far?
Yeah. So the reason for the memorandum that I sent out a few hours ago.
Oh, so maybe I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, sorry, that was but it's very late breaking, and it's my apologies.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But so there is a document.
There is a document which I'll throw it up right now so that people can see it, and then really it's been guiding like a little bit of this conversation today. But my real thought is that councilors, members of the public, others could sort of send feedback, comments, thoughts, on reflection and response and help. Because as I said at the start of this hearing, I really would like us to be moving towards a kind of statement of public policy principles and expectations regarding these contracts that a majority of the council can support in a way that helps the folks who are at the bargaining table know what those expectations are, because it doesn't seem fruitful to me to sort of wait for a long time and then get the contracts and then vote contracts down, when what you really should have done at the start is kind of convey what are the public policy things that the council's weighing. So that's sort of the thinking behind this. But today what we have is just a draft document that, here we go. So I can actually share it just so people can see. Can you see it right now?
Yes, I can see it.
So yeah, so this is it's a draft document that kind of articulates these 4 buckets moving through. So fiscal responsibility and fairness to all city workers, accountability for abuse of force and abuse of power, civilianization of civilian work. We're just talking about that. And then sort of transparency.
Great. Great. No, so I appreciate this and we'll look forward. I'll actually log into email now and find this.
And yeah, and so then it sort of has some potential areas that fall under each of those buckets. In kind of more granular detail related to the contract. And then people see exhibits scattered in here. The exhibits are mostly references to either police contract documents or presentations and stuff that we've heard as a council in the process of these conversations about overtime and about the contract. So this is meant, you can see there's a list of exhibits here. This is really meant to help to kind of collate some of the conversation we've had in a slightly less chaotic way.
Great.
move us in that direction of. And then I also put at the bottom here, there were some things that they're not sort of in the formal part of the memo that I did, but they reflect a bunch of issues that have come up, suggestions people have made, things we've heard from advocates that probably should still be included in further conversation that we're having about this. So those are attached in a kind of appendix.
And your intention is to share this widely for reflection and review, or just simply with
yeah.
the?
So I sent it out to the counselors this morning, and or right at noon. Maybe. And then and the hope is that I mean, as you see, we haven't been joined by the administration today. So figured that this was an opportunity to have a kind of initial conversation running through some of these buckets, but then hoping to get kind of comments and conversation coming over the coming weeks to figure out what are areas that we have consensus around and what are ones that we don't.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second so we can see other folks. Councilor Mejia, was that your hand up? Or no? Yes, go ahead. Councilor Mejia.
I forgot what I was going to say, but
I had raised the transparency issue.
Yes, I'm sorry, because we went somewhere else. So in regards to the transparency issue, is it possible for us to have to ask for a every 3 months some sort of data analysis about the decisions that they're making, who are they putting on for these details, how are they fulfilling their job descriptions? Is that too much to ask? Is that a lot? Can we get that in the dashboard?
Well, I do think that the vision of certainly what I took away from the police reform task force's proposals, if you look in that document, there's there's a recommendation 4 and a recommendation 5. And both of them are really about trying to make that kind of information about how the department operates much more broadly available. And I think it came up in our November, our overtime hearing with Councilor Campbell that, it's one thing for us to, for us as a council to kind of ask every quarter for overtime and other metrics and kind of draw that info out of the department. But it would be much better for overall transparency and for all advocates having access to that information if the department would just get in the habit of posting a lot more information publicly, to your point. So I do see the task force recommendations as moving us in that direction towards a real dashboard. Obviously, it doesn't exist yet. But I think one of the questions for us in the contract space is just making sure that the contracts don't have any provisions that prevent the department from sharing some of that data.
Can we in the contract, I know we can't negotiate the contract, but I'm just curious, can we put a cap, going back to Councilor Flynn's point that I also agree on in terms of the social and emotional and mental and physical well-being of our police officers? Is there a way for us to limit the amount of overtime and hours that people can work if it impedes their ability to make sound decisions? Or, is that, can we do that?
Yeah, so right now the department has a 90-hour-a-week cap.
No,
and
that's not normal.
So I think
can we lower?
I think that's definitely, it's certainly one of the things that that they could negotiate at the table, and that that we could indicate a council interest in seeing.
Yeah, just because if we're concerned about their social and emotional and mental well-being, then I think capping it at a lower threshold can help address some of that. And then I also think in terms, and that has to be accountable. We have to be able to see that. We need to be able to track that. And we also, I think, in terms of accountability and transparency, is that we need to be able to have information and data about how many officers are on the job that have experienced, social and emotional trauma, and how we can help support them before they return back I mean, I don't think we could put their names publicly on, transparency. Like, I don't want to violate HIPAA laws, but is there a way for us to, even if it's just a number, of percentage of officers that are in need of social and emotional services that we can monitor?
Thank you. Thanks, Councilor Mejia. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's a difference between information about specific officers and kind of aggregate data, in the same way that we're seeing this aggregate data about the sort of long-term sick and injured list numbers growing. Obviously, I think we could explore what metrics exist about mental and like social health for officers as well. Councilor Sabi George, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just in response to some of Councilor Mejia's questions, we are, I think, next week, the end of next week, scheduled to have a hearing on the well-being of our first responders, both police, fire, and EMS. So we may be able to have some of that information for that hearing, and I'll certainly pass that along to the department. So I think also in line with some of Councilor Flynn's comments that I heard, again, part of, because I didn't have great service at that moment, making sure that our first responders across the board, not just police, have access to the support services they need, both for physical well-being and mental health, because, as we see the trauma that many of our first responders witness and see firsthand are both the primary and secondary trauma are really important to make sure that we're supporting our first responders. And we think about our police department in particular, as that's today's conversation. Again, as Councilor Flynn mentioned earlier, there's a very high rate of suicide among police and first responders, and making sure that services are intact to prevent that and provide opportunities for wellness, both physically and mentally.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Asabi George. Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think it really leads back to this point about how do you, I think asking our police officers to be the solution to all of our society's challenges is just such an impossible burden. And we should be looking for ways to provide a much better rounded suite of social services to support both them and the residents of the city. Any other, those are sort of the 4 categories that I wanted to move through. So I don't know if there are any other comments folks have before we close out for today. If I don't, all right, I think that's a leftover blue hand, right, Councilor Mejia? Yes, okay. Yeah. Great. So I think I'll just say again, this is a working session, and the goal was very much to have a kind of conversation amongst counselors about these priorities. And so I'll also look for counselor feedback and other feedback on the memo, which was really just an effort to kind of, I'll share it again just so people can see, an effort to kind of pull together the conversations we have been having. I just really want to stress that we only get an opportunity like this where we are both really talking about the public policy implications of our decisions around policing and public safety writ large, and also we're negotiating as a city our police contracts at the same time, very rarely. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us in this moment to be proactive about setting those clear public policy expectations on behalf of the council, recognizing the ways in which the proposal for new entities, whether it's a civilian review board, 911 civilian response, the possibility of civilian flaggers, all such things, really combining those proposals with what contract change would be needed to make them real. And then also thinking as we enter likely a couple of recessionary years for the city budget, really going into that, thinking about ways that we're going to balance our civilian and sworn workforces in a way that's fair, in a way that gets all of our work that serves the residents of Boston in a multiplicity of ways done, and sort of stewards our fiscal resources as responsibly as possible. So as the Ways and Means Chair, I'm going to continue to pursue this line of conversation, and recognizing that the role we have to play is not a role at the table, but it is a really strong public policy advocacy role on behalf of the public interest in these contracts. So that's the spirit of today, and it'll be the continuing spirit of this work going forward. So I'll just say one more time, if folks are watching the hearing, if you email ccc.wm, that's WM for Ways and Means, at boston.gov, we can get you a copy of the memo we were discussing today. And I think with that, I'll give my colleagues one more opportunity if anyone had a comment, and then otherwise I'll close this out. All right, seeing none, this working session of the City Council's Ways and Means Committee is adjourned. Thanks so much, all.
Thank you.